Thank you so much, Ethan, and thank you, Zach. Ethan, also for the incredible tour today. It was amazing to see this campus again through new eyes, and so exciting to see all the things that have been going on. So it is such a thrill to be a part of this incredible lecture series. It made a huge impact on me back when I was an undergrad student, and there wasn't even a Stanford architecture program yet. And it feels more than a coincidence that the theme for this series is uncertainty. It's a framework that's been deeply ingrained in our mindset from the start and a sort of evolving generative mode for nearly all of our work. We think this uncertainty is the oxygen for action, for making things, for doing things, for engaging with people and communities, for making meaningful improvements to the environments where they are rather than where perfection might be. We've tried to take the prompt of uncertainty head on in this talk, and we will speak about our work a little bit differently than we might otherwise, framing our work about how we approach the things we might not know. As I alluded to, I was an undergrad at Stanford, and I come from a deeply Stanford family. Both my parents, who are here in the second row, are professors in the medical school. My little sister, in typical little sister fashion, tagged along and joined me here as an undergrad as well. And without digressing into a long preamble, I just want to say that this place made an enormous impact on my life, my way of navigating the world and career, and in some ways that are only just becoming apparent to me now. Anyways, it means the world to be back here. I majored in public policy as an undergrad, and I think this background clearly shapes a lot of the work we'll show you today.
On the other hand, I got to know the campus in a different way. Before we started SAW, I was a project landscape architect with Andrea Cochran Landscape Architecture for the Windhover Contemplativist Center across from Robley Hall. So in other words, I saw Stanford from the landscape first. We founded SAW in 2014 with a focus on the productive tensions between architecture and landscape architecture. Instead of binary dialectics of interior, exterior, synthetic, natural, contained, continuous, or formal or informal, that are typically associated with landscape and architecture as separate disciplines, we seek to build environments that challenge our conceptions of experience, meaning, and utility over time. Buildings and landscapes operate on different timelines, but exist at the same continuum. Our projects seek to address urgent issues of the natural and built environment: housing, wildfire, healthcare, childcare, energy infrastructure, by expanding the time frame, oscillating between the immediate and the ecological through cyclical processes of observation and intervention. In the long run, subsistence is not enough. We need to produce the conditions to regenerate, to regrow, to enjoy, to thrive. With SAW, we seek to look closely, revisit frequently, and cut deliberately, positioning our work as a form of sustained stewardship of our environments.
Sorry, we should note also we work closely with this incredible team of people who is on the screen just a moment ago. This work is theirs as well. So a few years back, we were challenged to reconsider our work to date through the lens of a concept of objective. It was an illuminating exercise and our first conscious engagement with the role of uncertainty in our work, which at the time we explained a little bit like this. When I was in architecture school, I went to see a movie about an indie rock band, which somehow turned out to be the story of a singer looking into his late father's work in quantum physics. There was a cat in a box, that's Schrodinger's cat, of course, and light particles fired at two slits. Supposedly, until you open the box, the cat is both dead and alive. This is a section of the slits that I came across. From what I gathered, it seems that there are infinite possibilities for any situation until you observe it. And by looking, you define the object. And there are probably some obvious times to observe things: the start of work, the end of its life, and somewhere in between. But there are also the ones you don't expect. Here's the basic formula: buildings fall apart, landscapes emerge. In a simple way, we had to question, when is a project ever complete? More than anything else, other objectives was an attempt to refocus intent through the lens of outcome. Like Schrodinger's cat, both dead and alive until the box is opened, our objectives are defined by how the work is viewed and how it behaves at a particular moment in time. Conditions change, projects are used and misused, things break, plants grow, and buildings crumble. We realized that it's possible for a design process to be totally appropriate, but for the resulting thing to somehow be misaligned. And we've become comfortable with the loosening of our grip on a singular predetermined objective, rather designing for a range of possible outcomes.
Developing a complex. The house was originally occupied in 1934, but we first encountered it after construction had started anew over 80 years later. A renovation was actively underway. Doors and windows had already been ordered, and the foundations were being poured. But the client had felt uncomfortable about the design direction, feeling there was more to the site, and asked us to come in and eventually start designing on the fly. It was late 2018. Patterns of life had, of course, changed quite a bit since the 1930s and would continue to change radically in the next year or so. The house would need to expand, but also shrink in some important ways. To the client, it lacked the front. It exceeded the front setback. To create a new figure, we would have to carve away, leaving 50% behind. This approach was pragmatic on a number of levels, including economy, sustainability, and so on. The process of carving allowed us, maybe forced us to displace doors and windows from the ground to the sky. It was not required that we keep the half on the bottom, and so we didn't, isolating remainders in the air. As you can see here, we worked to develop drawing techniques that would help us limit the degree of uncertainty we would encounter on the site for the things that we did in fact control. The pandemic started and the children moved back home, improvising classrooms, offices, and bedrooms at disparate corners of the home. New structures helped. First, a 3-story tower attached through a glass corridor, then a freestanding guest house, a trellis, a pavilion. Height becomes a new form of privacy. The approach is simultaneously additive and subtractive, redistributing mass around the site, refiguring the forms that remain, and reorganizing the diagram of the centripetal house into something that is diffuse and distributed, connected but outward facing. The subtractions, sometimes subtle, sometimes dramatic, begin to define the exterior perimeters of what become the primary shared spaces, the gaps, the slips, and exterior courtyards. It is a house as an aggregate, a constellation, still orbiting around the rehabilitation of the primary residence for sustainability, economy, and posterity, but taking on the language of a collective, allowing for multiple family units to cohabitate, co-work, recreate, and coexist through a pandemic-driven reconceptualization of the home. Before we knew it, we were developing a complex. There's a corresponding relationship of exterior moves to the interior. They produce surprises, but also new things to delight in. When old inefficiencies, another large window, became the efficiencies we had to use, it opens up a new realm of possibilities. We had a fun process of figuring out where to add these extra windows throughout the home, and as you can see here, led to new relationships between the spaces. It produces figures with personality, structures for light, structures for frame, structures for structure. The tectonic demonstrates notions of incompleteness to imply the continuation of perpetual reconfiguration. This became a launching point for a new line of inquiry in a number of our projects, a framework that we call subtractive reuse. Subtractive reuse approaches the repurposing of existing structures by seeing first what can be gained through subtraction. Much of our work engages reuse of outmoded buildings for reasons of sustainability, economy, timeline, and historical context. While market forces reflectively pressure for perpetual additions, there's often already more than enough space, too much volume, excessive poche. Instead, we prioritize looking to see what can be removed, improving environments by making space for light and air, introducing perimeter, and by allowing the landscape to penetrate deeper. We add back only if necessary. It is an act of maintenance that allows for the regeneration of structures and communities towards sustained vitality. We'll come back to this a little later.
This project is a speculative collaboration we did with Niraj Bhatia and his office, The Open Workshop, as an attempt to address the needs of the housing shortage crisis plaguing San Francisco and, frankly, the rest of the state of California. We also view it as an exploration of the problems of perceived certainty rather than uncertainty. With my parents here, I think I'm legally obligated to include them in the origin story, and sure enough, this house, their house, was critical to our start. But the big thing here was that we were trying to situate the cycles of our own family. After all, families expand and contract all the time, and yet houses tend to just stay the same. Yet the general discussion and understanding around capital H housing assumes that a weird stability, even rigidity about what a house is, even what a family is. And this is really hurting our ability to provide good enough or even just enough places to live. The plotting of lots in San Francisco produced thousands of 25-foot wide parcels that casually coerced the predominant housing typologies to pack services, circulation, and structure along the party walls, reifying private ownership and property division. In other words, our housing structures are in the shape of our properties rather than our families or communities. For one, models of ownership can certainly be broadened. Ideally, a community land trust would be implemented to establish the foundation for lot mergers. But in time, we believe that lots will bring us together, replacing property divisions with renewed interconnectivity, communal courtyards, and cross-block cuts, challenging the notion of single-family isolation. This project provides a framework for alternative models of land tenure and building ownership that could eventually catalyze connections across and between lots by orienting the series of prefabricated infrastructural cores perpendicular to the parcel to emancipate the party wall. These cores, which we've been developing through our other projects, including the Kawikoa Core House in Maui, seen here on the left, concentrate the most complex building systems and structures into efficient elements that define the new urban grain. A series of simple, sliding, and easily constructible and demountable partitions span between these cores to provide flexible forms of occupation that acknowledge a range of family forms, co-living, intergenerational living, found families, that go beyond the nuclear family. For instance, an array of 3 bedrooms could be opened up to 2 larger rooms or a single suite. The flexibility is translated to the front, where a unique tripartite facade is activated by movable planter bays that can be reconfigured by the user based on interior occupation. And built from the cross-laminated timber that spans between the cores, the party walls are also structurally alleviated, enabling myriad configurations that bridge across lots. For instance, 2 adjacent lots can be joined laterally, allowing for larger scaled units as well as co-living arrangements structured around a central courtyard. Or if joined back to front, a generous access way through the block would offer the rear yard as a space to be shared with the city. Increased density is achieved by the sharing, aggregating, and scaling of how low usage, high cost amenities such as kitchens and through the consolidation of stair cores following the Seattle Model Code of single stair dwellings. Cores can be seen here in green. Critically, this allows for the reciprocal aggregation of landscape spaces, allowing the landscape to become softly layered thresholds between family clusters rather than hardened property line walls. While spacious in a single base unit configuration, when aggregated, it opens up the expanses across the property lines for a more dynamic, reciprocal form of urban living.
We continued this line of inquiry and extended it through the Los Angeles Small Lots Initiative, focusing now on new typologies that still provide pathways to home ownership. Property ownership should not just be about having something fixed, but having something more pathways to short or long-term income, as well as more flexibility to expand or contract as your needs change. Here, we leverage a proposed evolution of the ADU type to increase density while decreasing redundancy, to provide autonomy while increasing the benefits of shared amenities or communal luxuries. While the parcelization of land into distinct lots often tears us apart, spatially and socially, our proposal asks how strategically forming lots in tandem with a new housing type can bring us together. The site is organized into 4 development parcels, each containing a primary dwelling, ADU, and junior ADU, a distinct typology blending a podium and 2 non-combustible microtowers of stacked bedrooms and service cores. Cross-axial lot arrangement of the towers enables permutations of dwelling sizes for a range of family forms, needs, and economic capacities. The space condition provides 12 units of housing structured around expansive communal spaces while providing the sense of possibility for the ADU's reabsorption into the primary dwelling. The proposal is grounded in a redistribution of the ADU's communal programs to foster increased flexibility. By paring the ADU down to a minimal footprint and pulling out poorly functioning micro-communal programs, such as mini kitchens, laundry, and dining, that are then aggregated, enlarged, and shared between units. This provides a higher quality and increased diversity of shared amenities, outdoor kitchens, laundry areas, maker and dining spaces, gym and spa that allow ADU residents to live both independently and luxuriously. This highlights how paring down to the essential infrastructure of a dwelling doesn't correlate to having less, but rather catalyzes increased community resilience, support, and care.
Okay. Release from the unbound cycles. There's a way to talk about this project that was originally intended. Interlocking boxes, organized program, materially twisting towards the sky, finding unlikely alignments in rotation, rooting into the landscape, and peering over the bank. Complex systems of mass timber, expressive steel frames, and jagged concrete provide material relationships to the landscape, both within and without. The sawtooth concrete board form animates light, softens texture, and hardens against fire. The syncopated rain screen repurposes old-growth redwoods mottled and felled by wildfire, turning another fire's tragedy into a robust new enclosure. Aligned towards long vistas as well as quiet contemplative spaces, and then twisting to provide shade, break scale, and peer towards the framed views of San Francisco, Stanford, and the Valley. Redwood and eucalyptus from grand trees felled by the fires and ensuing mudslides suggest a material form of regeneration, as well as luminescent figuring. We anticipated change over time, silvering of wood, softening of concrete, thriving of native plants, but the change came far too fast. We first met Aruna, Sanjeev, and Milan Gambier in 2012. They were our first real clients, and over the years, we became close friends and worked together on a number of projects. This house in Portola Valley was our most personal and most ambitious project. Aruna and Sanjeev's son, Milan, got cancer and died in 2015. He was 16 years old. This project, this house, was part of their effort to continue on. We spent years searching for land together and found this incredible plot in Portola Valley with views across the bay and all the way up to the city. The day after they closed on the property, Sanjeev was diagnosed with cancer as well. Sanjeev died in 2020 while the project was slowly working its way through planning approvals with the town. Aruna was determined to see the project through, now for her husband as well as her son. But somehow, incomprehensibly, cancer came for Aruna too. She never wavered, at least not that I could see, and never stopped believing that a good outcome was possible, even probable, even as it became clear to her and eventually the rest of us that she wouldn't be here to experience it. As we mentioned before, we often wonder when a project is complete. When is it whole? Perhaps it's the evening of February 24, 2024, as seen in the photograph here, when we visited the project site with Aruna's family and friends after her memorial service. Perhaps it was the warm day in June when we photographed the completed construction site, or perhaps it was the October afternoon when we photographed the active construction site, taking final form just a few weeks before Aruna died. In the photos on the left, this was Aruna's house still. In the photos on the right, the so-called complete ones, she had passed. The last time we spoke, she told me that Sanjeev would have liked the term moksha for the house, a concept similar to nirvana, meaning relief from the unbound cycle of life and death. And in this case, this is what remains. I want to note too that Sanjeev was the chair of radiology here at Stanford. He was one of the foremost cancer researchers in the country and world. Before she died, Aruna arranged for the proceeds of the sale of the house to fund endowed chairs in cancer research at UCLA and here at Stanford, both places where Sanjeev had worked and taught. And it's a small thing, but as an avid walker and hiker, Aruna took interest in the landscape for the house. Most of her original program goals for the project were about the landscape. We visited the house again last week, and it was encouraging to see the garden continue to thrive, continue to grow. Full of birds, full of pollinators, full of other forms of life. And the new owner followed through on some of the Gambir's original plans, installing the reflecting pool in the area meant to honor Millen.
Our office is located in the historic Dogpatch district of San Francisco, an almost post-industrial neighborhood of the eastern side of the city. Here you see what we see out our window, looking across Port Authority warehouses, turned to tech workshops, and across the bay to Oakland. Importantly, those hills in the background are a WUI zone, part of the wildland-urban interface. It's usually easy to forget just how fire-prone this region is. Then again, there are certain moments when you observe something so unsettling that you realize it'll be hard to view the world the same way again. The year 2020 was full of those moments, and this was one of them for us. On September 10, 2020, still in the depths of the COVID lockdown, we looked out the window of our office at 10 in the morning, and this is what we saw. The sky turned dark orange from a blanket of smoke from a series of intense nearby wildfires. And as the years have made clear, these fires are not stopping, so we realize that what we need to do is figure out how to live with them. And sure enough, wildfire continues to have a primary impact on more and more of our projects. It might be an obvious point to many of you, but worth pausing for a moment to consider what is the role of architecture in wildfires. 1, shelter. The building should be prepared to protect people from flames on the outside and to allow people to escape from inside. 2, fuel. This one is less intuitive. The very construction logics of our structures have a significant impact on the relative spread of wildfires, not to mention the impact of the construction industry on the changing climate, contributing to the frequency and intensity of wildfires. But in much of the conversation about how to address these things, it seemed that a rift was being cleaved between an interior environment that was safe and an exterior environment, which was dangerous. Coming from our interdisciplinary practice, that approach felt suspect, even detrimental. We'll argue rather that this deepening disconnect between building and landscape is only exacerbating the conditions that produce uncontrollable burning. So as we would encounter precarious sites like these in the Santa Cruz Mountains, we realized we needed to develop a less reactive approach. Not only did we need to deal with fire, but we needed to engage in the cultural and ecological systems that produce them. In search of a more holistic approach, we headed to Rome and Japan for 9 months of 2025 through the Rome Prize Fellowship in Landscape Architecture at the American Academy in Rome and the Creative Artists Fellowship from the Japan-US Friendship Commission and the National Endowment for the Arts. We had a few connections to these places in mind at the outset. First, Italy shares a Mediterranean climate profile with California, but has thousands of years of historical archives. We, of course, had heard of the stories of Nero fiddling as Rome burned, but were excited to visit the newly accessible Domus Aurea, Nero's elaborately landscaped palace and gardens built immediately in the wake of the Great Fire of Rome. We also knew of a shared tradition between California and Japan of wood-frame structures in urban areas. In addition, Japan's numerous fire festivals throughout the country promised new interpretations of fire. Even with these expectations, it was still striking to discover what an incredible organizing effect the potential for fire has on both material and human systems. One through line is that the threat of fire has often led communities to willingly surrender some degree of autonomy to increased government oversight in exchange for the fire prevention, including the first state police force, which grew from the fire watch vigils in Rome. In Edo period Japan, private homes were tasked with supporting fire watchtowers in order to organize community protection and response. Bands of samurai, warriors, merchants, even barbers would carry flags into firefights in displays of force and cohesion. We became particularly interested in these fire towers. And of course, the so-called Great Fires of the 1800s and early 1900s, along with pressure from the insurance industry, led to our first building codes in the United States. The Sanborn fire insurance maps became a defining spatial representation of collectivized risk for generations and are still used today. We're left with a bit of a conundrum. We've come to understand that from the perspective of landscapes, fire is often productive and actually reduces catastrophic risks. But from the perspective of buildings, fire is still bad and must be suppressed. While in Rome, we became fascinated with the artist Alberto Burri and his combustion paintings, in which he used flame to compose through a variety of mediums, producing new forms of representations of combustion, leading to city-scale memorials such as this one for the loss of the town of Gibellina. Burri used the rubble to calcify and memorialize what remained. In the Japanese context, we traveled across the country to learn from the city's deep traditional spiritual relationship to fire, attending a number of fire festivals. The common thread throughout these festivals is that fire, man-made in this case, symbolizes a significant threat, but also an opportunity for regeneration and renewal. Beyond the symbolic meaning ascribed to flames, we came across two festivals in particular that centered around the construction and carefully choreographed destruction of architecturally expressive structures as part of the ritual. In other words, buildings that are meant to produce meaning while burning over some period of time, a structure that performs after being set on fire. This is the Noza Onsen Dosijin Fire Festival, which occurs on January 15th each year for approximately the last 300 years. As part of the festival, logs from a family forest are cut and carried through town as part of a procession and erected into a shrine on site with offerings from the town and participants. 42-year-old and 25-year-old men, these are said to be the unlucky years in Japan, stage a battle to both protect and destroy the shrine, which is eventually set on fire. In Noza Onsen, it's tradition to bring blocks of mochi to the site of the burnt shrine the next morning. If you roast the mochi over the embers, you'll experience a year of good health. At the Daizenji Tamataragu Shrine's Onio Festival in Kurume, just outside Fukuoka in the southern part of Japan, there's a 1,600-year-old tradition held each year on January 7th. 6 giant torches are lit as the culmination of a week-long festival starting on New Year's Eve. The torches are roughly 13 meters long, 1 meter wide, and weigh around 1.2 tons each, and are made 3 days ahead of the event. The structure is intense and evocative, and carefully arranged to burn in a controlled way over time. They support occupation above, carrying sticks from below, and move around and complete a cycle around the temple in a fixed amount of time. The festival starts with smaller neighborhood group bonfires, which are then spread to the enormous torches in the middle of the temple grounds. The ropes are cut back gradually to control the pace of the burn, and burnt remnants on the ground are considered lucky, collected eagerly by festival goers. As mentioned, this festival always occurs on January 7th. While in Japan, our kids used to say we're in the future because of the time difference. But as a horrifying split screen began to emerge as the astonishing but all too familiar wildfires started ripping through Los Angeles on California's January 7th last year. Our time in Japan taught us about a very different cultural relationship with fire, depicting fire as a cyclical force of glittering destruction and possible regeneration. As we walked through the streets of Naramachi, 3/4 full red buckets were on prominent display in front of each structure, demonstrating symbolically, at this point, at the very least, that living amidst the threat of fire is a cooperative community endeavor. We became particularly interested in the traditions and forms of fire watchtowers, dating back to Edo period Japan. These structures were community infrastructure for collective safety. We noticed quite a few similarities with the vernacular fire lookout towers in the United States. Tall, simple, expressive structures with small footprints provide a vantage point to surveil defensively and warn of coming threats. In Japan, however, these watchtowers, built out of wood, were placed in urban areas to monitor the risk of urban fires. But in the United States, they were intended to look over the landscape rather than cities in order to prevent the spread of forest fires. But in both cases, the posture is explicitly defensive, stop the spread of fire. But what if the fire does come? What happens next? How can we allow for the regenerative qualities of fire that we have observed from, say, forest ecology or Japanese fire festivals? As part of the Creative Artists Fellowship from the Japan-US Friendship Commission, we were commissioned to collaborate with the Japanese architect Tomotsu Teshima and produce an installation at the US Pavilion at the 2025 Osaka World Expo. We are interested in the vernacular forms of the fire watchtowers in both the United States and Japan, but instead imagine them as elements to place in the landscape after wildfires in order to focus on what comes next, that something, in fact, does come next. This bell was custom made by a local steelworker. The ladder is removable, and all of the wood, a clear, sustainably and traditionally harvested hinoki wood, was assembled without metal fasteners. It was positioned on a landscape at the US Pavilion, looking out at the intense parallax of a converging form meant to imply a long horizon. If we believe that wildfires are natural and inevitable, which we do, then the fundamental question is how we design what remains. The expo has now ended and the fire tower has been relocated to the United States Embassy in Tokyo. Back to the LA fires in 25, the inevitable and urgent questions of how, when, and where to rebuild emerged immediately with yet another round of slacked environmental standards and increasingly restrictive statutes for building, hardening, defendable space, and fire suppression systems. In our understandable haste, many efforts will be made to take familiar building materials, for instance, the vernacular wood siding board, and make it out of less combustible composite materials, but otherwise look and perform in exactly the same way. There's a practicality in this approach, but also a delusion. Our collective understanding of how our built environments relate to and even participate in fire will not change until we offer another conception of what these buildings and landscapes are. From the perspective of an increasingly combustible environment, they are fuel. What we hope to find is a more symbiotic relationship with wildfires, expressing material form with this new language through the lens of fire, and producing buildings and landscapes for which fire is not the end, but rather a condition of existence. Perhaps we should be considering how our built environments from the perspective of the landscape. In other words, what if some things, some structures, perhaps even some buildings were meant to burn? This is a project that's probably familiar to any architect here, the Bruder Klaus Field Chapel by Peter Zumthor, that was built by forming logs on the interior of the void space, then burning them out once the concrete had set. And without ascribing a more moral judgment to it, it's worth questioning in this climate if houses are not in fact programmed to burn. They are architecturally, materially, fuel. And if this is not the case, you wouldn't know it by the reflexive toolkit of architectural strategies that are being deployed in response. And rather than armoring, encasing, and distancing these structures and hoping they don't explode, we would be better off to consider a logic of landscape and architecture that is not an expression of things that want to burn but shouldn't. A number of familiar material strategies exist that are non-combustible, and each have clear potentials and limitations. But beyond materiality, a post-fuel architecture might consider the hierarchies of the landscape, allowing important, compact, and complex core spaces, think the heritage oaks, to be robust, rigid, and fully non-combustible, while other looser spaces, simple containers of space activated by program, like the understory brush, could be flexible, nimble, detachable, or maybe even allowed to burn. Here we have some early experiments about structures that could be allowed to partially burn, but carry the infrastructure for quick renewal in a variety of different forms and configurations. And as we should have guessed, it turns out there was already a version of this type of structure in pre-modern Japanese architecture, the Kura storehouse. In short, these structures were designed around a central, protected, often fireproof storage room. The wood structure would be allowed to burn, while important objects would be protected. People could then live in the storehouse temporarily while the remaining structure was rebuilt. We think a key part of the solution ties back to a quote from an anonymous forestry official in response to the LA fires, that architects need to invent new forms of beauty in order to allow ourselves to imagine coexisting with fire. Perhaps we need to model post-wildfire landscapes from the same expressive care as newly constructed ones, or model the coexistence of that which has burned with that which will not. We published a more lengthy discussion of our research on this topic in Log 64, edited by Stanford's very own Emmett Zeifman.
The whole house. So among the strategies currently embraced by sustainability-minded architects is to prioritize the practice of adaptive reuse of existing structures. Various statements from the American Institutes of Architects take the position that, quote, the greenest buildings are the ones that already exist, unquote, to the end that rehabilitation is now preferred over new construction. There's an appealing clarity to this vision. To the degree that they can adequately perform the contemporary tasks of architecture, these materials are at sunk cost in terms of carbon emissions, and that impact can be substantial. However, this sort of material adaptation introduces significant new complexity around building performance and economies of production. Further complicating matters, homeowners in the United States typically hyphenate their homes with their primary financial investments, incentivizing the addition of new square footage in most residential or renovation contexts, rendering the reuse as an appendage to an additional new construction. Due to a variety of opportunities and constraints, much of our work engages reuse of outmoded buildings for reasons of sustainability, economy, timeline, and historical context. However, rather than reflexively adding, we seek to approach these projects through the lens of subtractive reuse, repurposing existing structures by seeing first what can be gained through subtraction. I'll take you through one of these projects in a little more detail. For this specific project, the existing house was too big, too deep, too dark. So we cut a large parallelogram-shaped hole in the approximate center of the structure. The house, once centrifugal, became centripetal, drawing activity around a verdant courtyard, animating movement, light, and patterns of use around a layered landscape. This, of course, destabilized the structure, inviting, even requiring, many systems to be reworked. The strategy allowed us to achieve significant savings in materials, permitting timeline, and construction cost, while using the opportunities of whole building systems made partial through subtraction to develop new hybrid assemblies for millwork, glazing, envelope, and even mechanical systems, while repositioning patterns of life in relation to the structure, landscape, and broader environmental context. Our intention here is twofold: to make a new home that is highly responsive to the particular context and existing structure, and to develop broader frameworks of subtractive reuse that we might be able to apply to a wide range of projects. So I'll present the project through the developing lenses of these frameworks with the intention that they become repeatable. There's also significant pressures on the real estate market that extends well beyond the Bay Area. In our experience, it has become common to encounter clients who are thinking through their projects with an abstract notion of possible future median buyers sitting on their shoulder, guiding their choices. This is because for many American homeowners, their homes are also by far their biggest financial asset, and preserving and enhancing the monetary value of this house is essential to their long-term financial planning. Clearly, this is a result of broad systematic market forces. This UN Human Rights Council report from 2017 identifies that the financialization detaches housing from its connection to communities and the human dignity and security that are the core of all human rights. Much of the building stock we encounter now, especially houses, are both under perpetual pressure to accumulate value in the forms of square footage, and that the found condition we encounter in most houses has likely already been corrupted by that pressure. It would be reasonable to assume that any house built in the last 50 years is likely to be guided by pressures to maximize square footage rather than improve living conditions. In this case, you can see that the surrounding forces are gathering to render this house as small. Here is the house as we encountered it. The base unit is a simple gabled roof volume with a few appendages attached to it. It seems that the footprint was too broad for the pitch of the roof to play out, so certain areas become low, dark porches around the exterior. Each room was a little too large in plan, but a little too small in section. And from wherever one entered, a mysterious enfilade maze would unfurl in one direction or another. The core of the house was dense, dark, confusing. with little engagement to the exterior or coordination of building systems, despite the huge amount of attic space and other pochés. Accordingly, the exterior of the structure was relatively disengaged from its context, creating a thick, dark threshold around the perimeter. We were really fascinated by the work of Gordon Maddock Clark and his version of holes. The Bronx floor on the right and the whole house on the left have some strong formal and even procedural connections to the project. On the whole house, for instance, you see a cut being made to the center of the roof and a section of that roof extracted. In a direct sense, we attempted a similar move here as well, cutting and extracting a parallelogram towards the middle of the roof volume, crossing the ridge beam ever so slightly. We thought of the subtraction itself as a generative act, mindful of the positive tension, Michael Heiser's double negative, and of course, had an awareness of centuries of courtyard typologies from Egypt to Asia, from Rome through Rossi and beyond. And it turns out there's also a clue lurking deep within the floor plan, sort of calling out as a challenge. There's an unusable room in the middle of the house, lofted above drop ceiling and capped with a skylight. Why would anybody put this here? What were they even trying to do? How would that even work? And could you even do that right? There's a door into the space, but no room for anything else. And the curious use of stained glass suggests the possibility of a landscape, although strangely. But maybe the most important lesson for us from Maddock Clark was that beyond the act of subtraction, there was the solidness of the chunk being removed and the fundamental destabilization of the things that remain, in some cases to a greater degree than we anticipated. From the exterior, this is what we removed. Now, I don't want to give the impression that the entire process of designing this house was subtractive. Rather, we took out as much as we could, as much as would be beneficial, and added back only when necessary, with as light a touch as possible. The goal is not so much to be net negative in area, but to reverse the adverse effects of bloat, making the building serve the inhabitant more efficiently and more slowly. To that end, not all subtraction takes from the interior and gives to the exterior. In this case, there was a tremendous amount of extra volume locked in as poché in the attic spaces, in service of mechanical distribution systems and what I'd call vague notions of insulation. We subtracted all of this. And despite the relative massiveness of the vaulted roof form, this was the experience of volume in the kitchen, but really actually nearly every one of the spaces. What was most surprising was the relatively low density of stuff in the attic space. It seems that volume had not been monetized in the same way as area, allowing for extremely loose aggregations of structural bracing, blown insulation, and conduits. The pressures that had bloated the plan had not yet made corresponding moves on the section. And while we subtracted from the attic, we filled within the elements of the roofline, programming spaces so that even areas with low ceiling heights could nestle in. Late in the process, we were asked to extend an elevated deck off the living room, which became a suitable space for a carport and eventually became a new garage. This allowed us to convert the existing 3-car garage into an unofficial ADU. And while the garage space was indeed added, the number of garage parking spaces was actually reduced from 3 to 2. Without significantly modifying the roofline, the strategy of cut and fill more than doubled the volumetric space of the living, dining, and kitchen, resulting in this formal transformation from the exterior and this one on the interior. The core of the sustainability imperative for adaptive reuse from the AIA and others is the potential to avoid emitting carbon through the use of new materials by using the existing materials for which carbon emissions are already a long ago sunk cost. For approximately 3/4 of this project, this strategy worked really well. We were able to more or less reuse the entirety of the existing foundation, nearly all of the framing in the bedroom wing, and the entirety of the basement and garage area. However, though we made considerable efforts, both conceptual and detailed, to retain the framing of the roof structure in the main living spaces, we ran into issues that point to some holes in these material reuse logics. We worked with a structural engineer to come up with a plan to retain the roof structure. The catch was that the house, having been designed and built in 1980, was significantly understructured by today's structural codes. The solution was to take the existing 2x6 roof joists and sister them to new 2x14s at 24-inch intervals. This approach calced out and was certainly feasible from a structural perspective. It deleted the attic, but resulted in a thickened roof. Not ideal, but okay. So we were conscious, all the same, of allowing the 2x6s to extend past the wall as rafter tails to give the impression of a thin roof line. But ultimately, this was impractical. The 2x6s were badly undersized, had been irregularly spaced, and sagged significantly. The general contractor, who I should introduce here, the fantastic Maria and Francisco of Rico General Construction, they're busy, asked if they could be instead remove the roof entirely and reframe it with just 2x12s at slightly tighter spacing, something like 16 inches on center. The new material was to be used was basically a wash with the original design, but close to none of the original material was retained in the area of the house. If you look closely, you can see a fleeting double negative moment where the skylight of the strange sunroom is bisected by the void. In this corner, we had designed a way to remove this failing column by supporting the cantilever from above, but it was determined to be much easier and use negligible amounts of additional material to rebuild the corner from scratch. So in areas of this house, we found the logics of material reuse to create tortured configurations of framing members that approached complete solidity without coming close to providing the stability that material density might imply. Meanwhile, in other areas, these overlaps played out seamlessly with little noticeable conflict or redundancy. Which is all to say that at the scale and size of a wood-framed house, material reuse is an unreliable partner. It's still significantly beneficial in this project. Again, around 75% of the building was retained, but it requires careful thinking through the process of deconstruction and the eventual construction to keep evaluating design decisions on the fly. The pivot to new construction in this area didn't really require significant additional material over the original plan, and we feel that eventually the new and existing elements form a productive dialogue, and that nothing of value was lost in this isolated instance reconstruction. One of the causes frequently attributed to California's housing shortage crisis is just how hard it is to get new projects permitted. This too is a complex topic, but the TLDR here is that it's not uncommon in the Bay Area to spend years attempting to get a permit, even for a single family house on a previously developed site. And it's also worth noting that this onerous process is disproportionately fixated on the exterior massing of a building. The town of Hillsborough is known for a particularly restrictive approach to this design review. And while we did present at one design review hearing, the fact that we were keeping much of the massing outline intact allowed us to do some pretty radical things with the structure without lengthy scrutiny. Interestingly, there seems to be no trigger for subtracting elements from the volume unless historically protected, only for adding. Along the front elevation, you can see that the primary mass operates almost entirely within the existing volume. And in this elevation, the building profile is actually reduced. We estimate that remaining within the envelope of the existing structure saved us at least a year, maybe two, of permitting time. And while this type of reuse does not have the same narrative clarity of material reuse, that time is extremely valuable and has significant impacts on costs and other benefits to the owner and even the architect. So, in the spirit of subtraction in Mount Clark, we took great care in the process of making holes in things. The first type is wrapping around a corner. That's one of two types that I'll show you here. It's a critical moment to the front of the house and required careful planning in the thickness of the existing structures. It's a critical cantilever, again, the failing column below, but it also captures views that had not been visible in the space that are important to the site. We embedded a moment frame in this thickness, and we devised our own custom window system. We notched the top for drainage, and due to thickness, allowed us to inhabit the kind of smallness at the edge of this corner condition. It compresses the context into almost a filmic condition. These are the moves that allowed us to vacate the corner and treat it with purity. And now this corner becomes a register of different modes of inhabitation on the interior, different times of day, different seasons of the year. The other kind of hole, the most noticeable one here, is the up-down kind. A tent-like structure supported by two round steel posts attached by 1/4-inch shear tabs allows for flexible geometric orientations and the connection of different types of beams. Here's that connection in detail and also the sense of wood draping from it. We were taken by the temporary condition of actually draping, not to produce the whole, but actually the things around it. And that it could be seen from all the way down where these two skylights transfer light further down into the void, all the way into the basement spaces. Eventually, layers of sheetrock are added to the underside of the joist, further transforming the sense of porosity. There just weren't systems available to do what we needed them to do in this instance. Residential window systems these days are highly manufactured and far too complex to do aesthetically simple things, especially with non-orthogonal geometries or in site-specific ways. So we designed our own window systems out of basic parts: steel tube, angle irons, flat bar. Glass assemblies were literally ordered from a website, and these insulated glazing units provide the thermal break. The dividing lines are so much thinner and more layered than any other system we found commercially available, and it came in at less than half the cost of the next closest quote. It's probably the process of carefully unbuilding portions of the house, thinking of assemblies as becoming just basic parts again, that our approach to the finished details focused on using dead simple materials in concentrated aggregations in order to provide adaptability, transitional qualities, and textural differences to absorb and reflect difference. A similar approach to the elemental assemblies we used for the millwork as well. Mass custom, using exposed edges of finished ply to give rhythm and texture, but also allowing adjustments to be made in the field without costly refinishing. Extended to the simple materials along the garage, concealing the operability of the door. These assemblages serve the cuts, at times thickening, but always animating the thresholds. So briefly, everything was turned inward on the original circulation plan, but now there's not a single moment of circulation that does not directly engage the exterior. The conditions of light were limited before and have now changed to something more like this. The entry sequence slips behind the most solid structure of the house, moving through a deep gap parallel to the sidewall of the perimeter. It's a moment that reinforces a perceivable deepness to the floor plate, suggests a deep interiority of the house. However, the cut of the void dashes this understanding as soon as the front door is open, presenting the landscape towards the entrance and framing the sky as the initial understanding of the interior space. Peering from the interior through the exterior, back into the interior, sets up complex layerings, reflections, and frames. The notions of interior, exterior, solid void, and even the fundamental understanding of geometric form change as you move around the space, or through the day, or through the times of year. In this case, there is an outside, and then there is an outside, a deep exteriority. Other potentials for value. This is brief. Part of the argument that we're trying to make here is that there is something fundamentally wrong with the way the market thinks about housing. I imagine that's not a controversial position in this room, but I don't know. I suppose the test of this argument is whether we can economically, efficiently, practically produce something that deliberately undermines this framing of value, the relentless pursuit of square footage, that clearly produces heightened experiences of value. We've attempted to be deliberate in the ways in which we approach the manipulation and modernization of these building systems through permitting, design, and construction. But as landscape architects as well, we feel there's a particular imperative to the garden partie, which is what we call this project, that underlies the different but related divide in the ways in which value is perceived in design. Namely, it's extremely difficult to quantify the monetary value of the landscape in real estate formulations. So The displacement of square footage of living space with square footage of landscape space is both a decision about the quality of life and experience, but also a light provocation about the value of landscape spaces. And we'd suggest that by introducing the landscape to the deepest interior space of the house, the building turns inside out, allowing the entirety of the site to register as part of the home. Making room for the value of landscape and the non-monetizable. That requires an embrace of a certain type of uncertainty, which again, we think is basically the oxygen of design practice, and frankly, for making anything of value in the world. Thank you.